Hello and welcome to Bad Art. I am Colin McLaughlin-Alcock. My co-host, Mariel Grushko, is taking the day off today, but we have a special treat for you. We're joined by Jennifer Lynn Kelly. Jenny is an associate professor at UC Santa Cruz, and she's the author of the book Invited to Witness: Solidarity Tourism Across Occupied Palestine. It's a book that I can't recommend highly enough. I want to say that personally for me, it's been invigorating to read and teach and think with since it came out in 2023. It is a critical examination of the politics of solidarity tourism, where activists from around the world, and especially the U.S., visit Palestine as a means of building connection with Palestinian struggle. One of the more interesting aspects of the book, from our perspective, is the role of art in building this solidarity. Kelly describes several ways that art is used by tour guides to help tourists see Palestine, connect to its past, or imagine its future. We're really excited to talk about this and more. Jennifer Lynn Kelly, welcome to Bad Art.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, we're really excited to have you. So thank you for joining us.
Of course.
If you could start us off by just telling us a little bit about what solidarity tourism is and how you came to study it.
Absolutely. So I think in the book about how one of the major questions of the book is how solidarity tourism emerged in Palestine. And for a long time, I resisted defining solidarity tourism just because it was so differently applied and capaciously understood and hard to pin down to a definition. But what I came to is the labor of tour guides using pressing tourism into anti-colonial work, right? So pressing a form that has historically been so inundated by colonial state violence. Tourism, of course, has accompanied state violence, accompanied colonialism, set precedent for colonialism, laid down the groundwork for colonialism, and then did the justificatory work of explaining away the violence of colonialism. So, with trying to think about solidarity tourism, I tried to understand what it looks like when people try to use a form so laden with violence to do anti-colonial work, but it goes by a bunch of different names. So a lot of times, tour guides themselves would refer to this work in Palestine as justice tourism. Critics would have referred to it as occupation tourism, and the bifurcation between those two labels actually kind of illuminates the tensions of the book, right? Because justice tourism imagines it as sort of unproblematically arching toward justice, right? And occupation tourism, of course, imagines it as strictly voyeurism. So people in large part wanted me to either tell a story of solidarity tourism as inherently and wholly liberating or inherently and wholly voyeuristic and problematic. And in order to honor the labor of the guides, I refused to do either of those options.
And so, could you tell us a little bit about how you started researching this?
How I came to the project was circuitously through both my undergrad journey to the master's program, to the PhD, to the project. My master's thesis was on US Christian Zionism, and tourism is really central to US Christian Zionism. So a lot of the displacement in Jerusalem, for example, is because of building biblical theme parks for Christian Zionist tourists. And I wanted to go to the PhD. I had envisioned doing a sort of ethnographic study of Christian Zionism in Texas at UT Austin, surrounded by mega churches, right? Would have been
Right.
an excellent place to do an ethnography of Christian Zionism. But I wanted more to know about how Palestinians responded to that kind of violence through tourism. And so I had initially structured the dissertation as a sort of response-based analytic where I imagined having a chapter on Palestinian-led anti-Zionist Christian pilgrimage to Palestine in response to Christian Zionism, or queer delegations to Palestine in response to LGBT birthright. So I had this whole fictive dissertation proposal. And then when I began the research, talking with Palestinian tour guides, about their labor, it became clear that that response formula made no sense, right? And it was a much more sort of insular process emerging from less professionalized and more clandestine kind of tours and delegations during the First Intifada, and a history more rooted in Palestinian organizing. Then the book itself became more of a history of how solidarity tourism emerged as an organizing strategy against colonial state violence in Palestine.
Yeah, it's really interesting hearing all of these other sorts of tours that you considered first. And, it's interesting you said tourism has a colonial history. And I'm curious, like, how much that resonates or not with our listeners, like how many who would
Mhm,
recognize that immediately. But when you start talking about tourism to Jerusalem or tourism to Israel, it becomes like immediately apparent, right? That
mhm,
who's doing this tourism to Israel? You mentioned Christian Zionists, but Europeans in general looking for like a Christian heritage as part of the
mhm,
colonial project has a long history, as do you mentioned birthright tours. So, Jewish people who do not live in Israel coming to Israel to
mhm,
learn about it as a place that they belong to, both have these strong colonial infrastructures built up. And then the solidarity tourism, which you mentioned, is something different. And you highlight how it does have a clandestine history. It comes out of the shadows. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Like, where does it actually come from?
mhm. Yeah, so I had initially begun the dissertation with the chapter on in the wake of the Oslo Accords, because only with the Oslo Accords was there these gestures towards statehood, like the Palestinian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities with the PA, the Palestinian Authorities. So the first the chapter that began the dissertation was very much about solidarity tourism in the wake of having a Ministry of Tourism, having tour guides and licensing an option. And so I began the dissertation essentially in the Oslo Accords because that felt like a signal to me of when solidarity tourism as a profession began. And then when I had the dissertation defense, there had been some references to earlier, like when I would interview tour guides about their work in a post Oslo context, they would talk about having led delegations during the First Intifada or building on that history. But I didn't begin the story there. And when I had the dissertation defense, both my advisors, Barbara Harlow was my co-chair and Ella was on my external committee. And both of them insisted that the story begin before them. The story began with these First Intifada delegations that were referenced off and on throughout my research. And I talk to my students about this process all the time because I appreciate sort of demystifying the dissertation to book process and the sort of writing and sustaining an argument over chapters and chapters, because that kind of redirection shifted the whole tenor of the book, right? And so I started with the First Intifada delegations, and in order to do that, it was not from, I mean, a lot of the references were from my fieldwork in Palestine, but the the First Intifada chapter was largely culled from time in the Freedom Archives in San Francisco.
So, what are those?
So the Freedom Archives are this beautiful collection of archives related to movement work, and was in the Mission and now is Berkeley, and had just scores and scores of boxes on different delegations, different moments of solidarity between student organizers in the US and student and organizers in Palestine, and it had a lot of references to and advertisements for these early delegations, and it had a lot of report backs from these early delegations. And one of those report backs what became a book, which is Shana Gluck's book that was is central to the first chapter, as are a lot of the report backs that people did in the wake of visiting Palestine on these delegations, and the art that they produced on these in the wake of their visits, and the logics that they sort of relied on in their narrations in the report back genre. it's such powerful work, and oftentimes in that effort to produce powerful work in the wake of a delegation, and in that kind of like moment of urgency, there can be a lot of analogies there that are less thoughtful than they could be, right? And there often is a lot of this reliance on the politics of vision and visibility and veracity. So a lot of things that got kind of repeated in a lot of the report backs from the first Intifada were statements like, I could never have believed this until I saw it. I didn't believe it until I saw it, which is really ubiquitous in the sort of report back genre. And hearing that over and over again across decades, while simultaneously myself sort of archiving the interviews of tour guides who've been doing this work for decades, and the core of Palestinian studies where Palestinian scholars have long documented and theorized their own condition, was very hard to keep hearing, right? I couldn't believe it until I saw it. And so I felt like it was really important, I still feel like it's really important to pause at that kind of relation to Palestine.
Yeah. And one of the things you reference in your book, of course, is Edward Said's famous like call for permission to narrate,
Yeah.
and just the
Mhm.
question, can Palestinians tell you what they've seen? And when you have to have the tourist saying, I couldn't believe this until I saw it. I'm
Mhm.
returning to the US or wherever now to tell you
Mhm.
what I saw. It on the one hand, I think you present that as like that's a useful intervention, but on the other hand, it is continuing to refuse to allow Palestinians to tell their own story. So that occlusion that continues in solidarity tourism is quite,
Right.
I don't know if interesting is the right word, but
Right.
worth paying
Right.
attention to, right? Worth pausing.
Right. And the kind of sustained reliance on the witness as an international as a corroborator of Palestinian narration, right? The way that their report backs circulate as truth in a way that the Palestinians offering them that knowledge during their visit is not treated as reliable narration.
Right. So who is going? I mean, both in the Intifada and over time has it changed? Like, who are solidarity tourists themselves?
So I love this question because there are so many different answers,
Right.
right? So a lot of the delegations and tours are thematic. So, for example, like a BIPOC youth organizing tour is going to look very different than an annual olive harvesting tour. And so that shifts who is on each tour, but each tour itself has a lot of tension and multifaceted participation. So a lot of times, especially with like the harvesting and planting campaigns, you would have folks who have been to Palestine many, many times, right? And have brought their own children, have brought their grandchildren, or have had these sort of like long-standing relationships with Palestine, folks who have retired and have fallen in love with Palestine in different ways and would marry it like that. Some are church groups, right? Church delegations. One thing that is really central to solidarity tourism that I'm focusing on a lot in the second book is pastors,
Hmm.
anti-Zionist Christian pastors from different places in Turtle Island that are traveling to Palestine in order to do the work to reshape their congregation's relationship with Zionism, and are really cognizant of the many pitfalls of solidarity that can happen through that work. One of which, for example, is sort of Christian tourists being interested almost exclusively in hearing from Christian Palestinians,
Yeah.
right? I mean, this is true for Christian delegations, this is true for queer delegations. You often have a cautioning by the facilitator, cautioning solidarity based on a likeness in that way.
Mm.
So I remember, after the queer delegation Sarah Schulman organized, there was the homonationalism and pinkwashing conference that she organized in the wake of that delegation. And Haneem Mikey, the director of Al Cow's Queer Palestinian organizing space, had asked the audience, are you in solidarity with Palestine or are you in solidarity with queer Palestinians? And so I think that question, like, are you in solidarity with queer Palestinians or are you in solidarity with Palestine, is an anchoring question for a lot of solidarity tours, like asking Christian anti-Zionist tourists, like, are you in solidarity with Palestinian Christians or are you in solidarity with Palestine? And so thinking through how to build solidarity that isn't conditional on likeness and recognition
Right.
in across these spaces. So people are coming from and organizing spaces people are coming from. Some of the day trips are backpackers traveling to Israel who want to learn about Hebron for 3 hours on an afternoon. Some of the longer trips are people on gap year from European universities. There's a lot of blurriness between the kind of solidarity tours and volunteer sort of shifts in Palestine that they're the space of a tourist visa. So the dissertation was called Your Work Is Not Here, to
Mm.
flag that there is a kind of tendency for solidarity tourists who sometimes want to stay in Palestine, right?
If we can hit that for a minute, because that was a thing I had a note on. You know, I've never been on an organized solidarity tour, I don't think.
Mhm.
I've been in Palestine, and I was a student on a peace studies study
Yeah,
abroad in 2000,
right.
and then did some journalism work. But that was in 2000, right? And I remember when I thought about solidarity activists, what I thought about were people primarily from Europe and the US
Mhm.
who came and put themselves on the front lines. So they would stand between Palestinian protesters and Israeli soldiers in the supposition that their bodies would not be shot, and so they would delay the violence. And the
Mhm.
famous example of this is Rachel Corrie, who got killed by a
Right.
bulldozer standing in front of a house that Israeli soldiers were bulldozing. That's very different, actually, from the solidarity tourism you talked about. And in fact, it's discouraged, right? So, what's the difference, and why has that changed?
Mhm. Yeah, and I appreciate this question because I thought about it so much too. So I wanted to think about what are solidarity tourists being invited to do? What are the parameters of that invitation? What are the conditions of that invitation? What are the expectations of that invitation? What are the responsibilities of that invitation? Because the invitation is being extended by Palestinian hosts and guides and organizers who, of course, do not control their own borders, whose mobility is foreclosed and circumscribed. And so, what does it mean to extend an invitation under those conditions to a tourist? And what does that invitation look like? And so, one of the things that became really clear to me was that there is a slippage oftentimes for tourists imagining that they are there to do that work, right?
Right.
That their presence is protective presence in Palestine. And a lot of international presence contributed to more harm for Palestinian hosts in certain moments. And
How so?
um, for example, like internationals visiting a village and then having that village being further raided and further policed
Mhm.
by Israelis in the wake of that visit. And so part of that work in the first Intifada tours was an understanding of that risk and of that asymmetry and doing that work anyway of sort of educating tourists and educating internationals. And so I wanted to think about what that labor meant and looked like, what the conditions of that labor are, and one piece that was sort of instrumental in my thinking about it was Sophia Samatopoulou Robbins' piece on ISM, and it her piece was on is talks about prosthetic engagement. That article helped me think so much about the distancing that activists can do from tourism, because one thing that I learned from Sophia's article was her analysis of how ISM workers sometimes imagined themselves under occupation and didn't think about the asymmetries in their sort of capacity to leave and their sort of the fluidity of movement denied to the Palestinians hosting them. or their own she studied their kind of report backs, right? Like their own narration of being under occupation. And so I also wanted to think about how tourists narrated their own presence. And so what would happen is that tourists would say, like, I'm not a tourist, I'm a delegate.
Right.
And it was another thing that required a pause, right? Because for the hosts, they are leading a delegation on Wednesday and a tour on Thursday, and they're going to the same places and meeting with the same people and offering the same education to tourists and delegates. And oftentimes that belief in sort of protective presence or the sort of sometimes outsized understanding of their work in Palestine on the part of delegates was like a stark contrast to tourists who, even though tourism, of course, and rightly is more maligned, right, than delegations, but oftentimes the tourists had more willingness to learn because they had less attachment to their presence mattering in Palestine,
Right.
right? So instead of feeling like a delegate who's been invited to Palestine because of their movement reach, they are just tourists who will admittedly talk about what they don't know and talk about being there to learn, as opposed to being there to teach, or as opposed to being there to reach a certain amount of people in the wake of their delegation. And then those tourists would speak about how much they learned, how little they knew, and the conversations they had with their communities in the wake of their visit. So the assumption that delegations are somehow more meaningful than tours, or that delegates are doing somehow much more important work than tourists, solidarity tourists, that was an assumption that I wanted to sort of trouble.
Right. I think that's really interesting that for tour guides that the activity is very similar. So what sorts of things do tourists or delegates encounter? Like what makes a tour a solidarity tour rather than, a visit to a historic site or something?
Yeah, and that is centers on what kind of narratives tourists are receiving, right? And you'll see that in each of those spaces. So if you go to the Church of Nativity in Bethlehem, and Rivka Barnard has written so much about the history of tourism in Bethlehem. And if you go to somewhere like the Church of Nativity, you see sort of rotating scores of different tourists hearing different narratives.
Mm.
And some of those are sort of anchored to biblical narrations. Some of them are telling some of the sort of histories of the building of the church, right? And on a solidarity tour, you will hear about the Israeli siege on the church, right? And you will hear about the state violence um, enacted on Palestinians in Bethlehem. You'll hear about the building of the wall. You will go from the Church of Nativity to the wall for tourists just visiting the Church of Nativity from Israel. The wall essentially is invisible to them, and the kind of routing of their itinerary routes them away from any analysis of the colonial present, right? So on the solidarity tour, it's not just the narration that you get in each space, but also where that visit is located in the context of the rest of the itinerary for that day and for that week. So one of my interlocutors had critiqued the pace of the solidarity tour because as
Mm.
a format, it is remarkably fast. You're going to 4 different places in one day and through different kinds of differently segregated space. So you're going from through checkpoints and through different areas. So she called it like occupation boot camp because of the pace, and that it actually disallows any kind of like radical hospitality on the part of Palestinians that they are also attempting to do on the tours. And one of the things I wrote about with that question of pacing was a diaspora Palestinian on the delegation, where there was no time to stop for her to stop in her village, in her
Right.
father's village. And because it was like of tour in Nablus and Kanafa and Nablus, and then immediately going to be hosted for dinner at Tamimi's house, and the kinds of ways that that pace can enact these other forms of alienation, right?
Yeah. No, there's several things that I want to touch on in that comment. So I'm gonna try to do a drawing together. I mean, I think the point that you raise about the pace of the itinerary limiting certain kinds of engagement, I
Mhm.
think is really important. And one of the things that stands out to me from the book is your emphasis on solidarity tourism not just being, poverty porn, right? Like not just
Yeah.
being like a voyeurism of suffering. And yet the
Yes.
pace challenges that because you don't have the opportunity to make meaningful relationships to Palestinian hosts. You
Mhm.
don't have this opportunity to spend a extended period of time in in this person's family home, and so like those connections to people or places is limited by the very idea of the tour. Other thing that stood out to me, or the other things, you highlighted the scope of the itinerary, and that was something I wanted to talk about. The subtitle of your book is Solidarity Tourism
Mhm.
Across Occupied Palestine. So the across there does a lot of work. You are deliberate in studying the whole of historic Palestine, which includes Jerusalem, the West Bank, Gaza, and also the territory that was Palestine before it became Israel in 1948, and which is Israel today, right? And so
Mhm.
the movement across that may be easier not for tourists, but for Palestinians are segregated into these spaces and often within them unable to move. So like very different dynamics of movement. And then in preparing for this, I was looking at some of Ta-Nehisi Coates's comments about the solidarity trip that he went on. He was part of the Palestinian Festival of Literature, and then he wrote a book about it, which he talks about the experience of visiting Palestine and compares it to his experience as a black man living in the U.S. And one of the experiences that stood out to him the most was visiting Hebron because his guide couldn't walk with him. And his guide said, I have to stop here. You can continue. And then Coates moved through the checkpoint, was interviewed hostilely by an Israeli soldier, felt this experience of moving through a segregated space and said, oh, I recognize this as segregation that's somehow familiar to my experience in the US. But I think one of the big things about solidarity tourism is these encounters with the segregation and encounters with the obstacles. So walking through the checkpoints, meeting the soldiers, crossing a border that your guide is not allowed to walk with you, on the one hand exposes the violence of the settler infrastructure, on the other hand enacts it, right? The guide
Mhm.
has to be perpetually refused entry into Hebron for Coates or anyone else to go. So, not exactly a question, but I wanted to talk about these things with you because I think they're really interesting and important tensions in the tourist project.
For sure. And that's what I write about in that chapter on the fragmented itineraries, and the asymmetrical relations between tourist and tour guide navigating apartheid, right? Navigating racialized segregation and asking and organizing a tour. So for the on the part of the tour guide's labor, right? Organizing a tour that enables tourists to reenact the segregation that animates life, right?
Right.
In a space like Hebron. And part of that work is doing the work fully cognizant of those racialized asymmetries. And I think that that is the part of analyzing tour guide labor that was so important to me as a response to the idea that this is sort of nothing but voyeurism, because it requires so much labor on the part of the host and the guide to organize these tours with full knowledge and full awareness of the racialized asymmetries between themselves and the tourists. So not just that they cannot walk down Shohata Street, right, with their group of tourists, but also knowing that they are providing this pedagogical labor so that the tourist who is walking down this segregated street can then be heard in these amplified ways that also reenact that kind of racialized asymmetry and operating within that. And I think part of that, and this is what I talk about with my students a lot, is how we think about and do work that is circumscribed by the conditions within which that work takes place, and understanding the import of doing that work anyway. So a lot of things that they will sort of think about is, for example, like doing ethnic studies in in the neoliberal university, right? And how that work is imperfect and animated by so much so many contradictions, and they can see themselves as they can see how the import of doing that work in a context where that work is either tokenized or dismissed or underfunded or attacked, and the import of kind of doing that work anyway. And so what I wrote about so much was how tour guides do that work fully cognizant of the racialized asymmetries that make that work necessary. So if Palestinians were believed when they speak, if they were not met with demands to represent the other side, if the encampments for Palestine were not vilified at every turn, right? If Palestinians were treated as reliable narrators of their conditions, solidarity tourism would not be necessary. Like, and one of and Barbara Harlow would say, like, it's almost like your interlocutors are desiring the obsolescence of their profession. And one of the people in the Gaza chapter on this virtual tour says, I would love to just have a souvenir shop. I would love to not be a political tour guide. I would love to just be a tour guide. Right. And so what does it mean to sort of wish for the obsolescence of your profession? Because your profession is animated by that racialized asymmetry that undermines your own narration, and yet you do that work anyway.
One of the things that has stuck with me from reading the book is this virtual tour. So it's
Mhm.
impossible or almost impossible for people like us to go to Gaza, and has been for since like 2006. And yet solidarity tourism engages Gaza. And you start your chapter on Gaza with this virtual tour where people walk around, I think, Tel Aviv, and they can listen to like an analog tour of Gaza, which is only a few miles away, but inaccessible. And one of the things I really appreciate about it is it starts with, I think, an ice cream shop, right? She's like, "Oh, here's where the best ice cream in Gaza is." And, sure, she'll get into things that have happened, but also gives people the tours of the places that make life vibrant and exciting and culturally rich.
Mhm.
Um, Again, I don't have a question, but that's the thing I really
Yeah.
appreciated from the book.
I think that there is a version of the story of solidarity tourism you could tell that, like, excerpted the ice cream references,
Right.
right? I think there's a version you could tell that doesn't that finds that, like, irrelevant to the narration of solidarity
Right.
tourism, and that is what propels the possibility for the tourists to say, right, I never thought they would be hanging out in Palestine.
Right.
Who's, like, so surprised that there is, like, hanging out and talking about, like, movies and talking about books and talking about, like, the impoverishment of the imagination to believe that, like, pleasure and joy and mundanity and, like, frivolous conversations and ice cream happen, right? And so part of that virtual tour is also about, like, elbowing past people to get the flavor you want, and the kind of, like, tells you sort of the texture of the space and of the life and of the beauty. I wanted to think about how often tour guides intervene in the expectations tourists bring with them. So one of
Mm.
the examples of that is the expectation that tourists have that they're going to be met with, like, a carousel of suffering, right?
Right.
Just like a rotating door of narratives of trauma, and how tour guides upset that expectation often. And I think that's why Tanya Habjuka's work in Occupied
Mm.
Pleasures is so all over the book and the cover, because her work insists on it, right? Her work insists on naming pleasure and not believing that naming pleasure undermines your account of how violent and death dealing occupation is. So what I was trying to emphasize so much in the book was borrowing and building from Tanya's work and her insistence that narrating joy, talking about joy, is not answering that depoliticized human story demand, but it is instead insisting on what it looks like to build and imagine the sort of infrastructure for radical care for one another through pleasure and through joy under the vicissitudes of occupation, and that talking about that joy, making space in the narrative for the ice cream shop, for how it's right
Yeah.
reaching for these moments of connection, not undermine argument against the colonial present and its multiple death dealing harms. The same is true for nuance, right? Talking about how these tours are do traffic in the sort of voyeurism that you would expect them to. They do have groups funneling through refugee camps, right? And they do have these elements that are so deeply tethered to sort of voyeuristic tourist practice at the same time that they have this labor that tilts toward liberation and a free Palestine and insist on a free Palestine and insist on return.
Yeah, I wanted to latch on to, you mentioned Tanya Habjuka's photographs, and just you have several of these in the book. I've been lucky enough to see some and exhibited, but they're quite beautiful, and they're these lovely photos of Palestinians going about everyday life within constrained circumstances. And so you have, people doing yoga, practicing the javelin, getting ready for what looks like a prom, doing parkour, going to the zoo, and it's a lovely set of activities that they're really lively and they're beautiful photographs, and yet they do create a different kind of engagement with place. And I think
Mhm.
so many of the photographs we see today are just of death, right? And so it's just a
Mhm.
whole different way of encountering a space that you may not be familiar with. One other thing I wanted to talk about, so you were talking earlier about, one of the reasons it sounds like that the guides do this work is because they view it as important, despite all of the problems that you identify, to have people go back to the US and say,
Mhm.
this is what I saw, and to communicate some of the crisis to the US. But that's not it. That's not the only thing that tour guides get out of it. And I think one of the interesting things you highlight is the way tour guides use the tours, and sometimes art within the tours, as a way of constructing an alternate world that, prefiguring, right? Like that there is
Mhm.
sometime in the imagined future a free Palestine. What does it look like?
Yeah.
And the tours are actually a way of building that. I have two examples in mind. One is the tours to Miska, if you want to talk about what people do there, and the other is Gaza 2050.
Mhm.
Both of these, I think, are really inspiring examples of the ways that tour guides are actually able to do work that they want to do through these tours.
Yeah, and I think about the relationship between tourism and return so much through both of those examples, and
Right.
to understand what return could look like and what return must look like, and how to really think about like the sort of architecture of return, and return not as a slogan but as a future. And one of the pieces that whenever I talk about this work I assign with Sophia Azeb's piece in the Funambulist, which is who will we be when we are free, which insists on thinking about return in these deeply complicated ways that don't imagine that it will automatically ensure freedom, that we have to sort of work toward understanding what return will look like, right? And what a free Palestine will look like. And also what would the sort of infrastructure of return be like? So in villages, having people imagine like what a university would look like and where the flower beds would be and where the apartments would be and how what the space would look like and who would live there and what would it feel like and what would it smell like and what would the textures be. And Omar, the my interlocutor in that chapter spoke so much about the sort of like luxury to imagine and the
Mhm.
kind of the space that you sometimes even need to imagine return when you must not be preoccupied with imagining bread, right? And how to think through what it means to demand not just return, but also the space to blueprint return and be sort of an architect of return. And then the Gaza 2050 chapter or section of that chapter means so much to me because it is a description of a student initiative to imagine Gaza 2050, and it's a collaboration between Indiana University and Gaza University. And the fact that the students imagined tourism as central to a Gaza 2050 because they
Right.
wanted to be able to host, right? They
Yeah.
wanted to be able to host people and allow them to travel from Gaza to Jerusalem to Nazareth to Haifa across all of historic Palestine, insisting on the right to host and insisting on the sort of pride and place and beauty of Gaza that must inevitably hinge on the freedom of mobility and the refusal of the borders that circumscribe their movement and their caloric intake and every sort of other crushing of life and imagining that future and insisting on that future predicated on thinking about what it would mean to host tourists to a liberated Gaza. And part of that chapter is also, of course, the parkour team, and they do this, like, clap back to Banksy about the Banksy has that caricature of how you could never possibly be a tourist in Gaza, and how they are saying, like, "We would love to host you, and not only would we love to host you and show you our lives, but also we would love to be tourists."
Yeah.
And we would love to move, and we would love to see the world, and we're teenagers, and we wanna see the world, right? And so what does it this kind of wholesale disparagement of tourism and a inability to imagine what it might mean for those young people in lives, what it might mean for them, might also imagine tourism.
Yeah. No, the Gaza 2050 plan is just so inspiring. And you detail how the students, one, like said, what sort of infrastructure do we need? So, like, what hotels, what transit infrastructure, what do we need to build in order to be able to do this kind of hosting? And then at the same time, what does Gaza have to offer? And so they cataloged all of this, the sites, the historic materials, the other things that people might want to come and see, and built up, an itinerary of like when the border is open, when people can come, this is what we are looking to accomplish, and it's forward looking, inspiring and positive. Like, it's using tourism to imagine a future and to create this. I don't know if art is the right word for it or not, although there's a lot of art in that Gaza
Mhm,
chapter,
mhm,
but to create an imaginative space where a different world seems to become possible. Personally, you and I have talked before about this, and the tragedy of the last couple of years is that so much of what they identified is gone, not to
mhm,
mention how many of those students may still be alive, like, it's just a huge,
mhm,
huge tragedy. But I was thinking about that, like, combination between the hopefulness that that chapter continues to inspire in me and, like, the despair that I feel when I try to imagine,
mhm,
like, what's left. And I recently picked up this book edited by Dina Matar and Vidisha Porcher called Archiving Gaza in the Present, which talks about efforts happening now to preserve and restore these things, which I think is, an inspiring thing to keep an eye on. That,
Mhm.
this has been
Mhm.
knocked down, but people are thinking
Mhm.
about how to put it back up and build a future that goes beyond just remediating the immediate devastating harms of the genocide. Like that there
Mhm.
is something else about building a cultural space that thrives, that's still on the horizon.
And I think there's so much work there's so much work that insists on that, right? There's so
Right.
much work. I think of the Vivian Sansour and the Palestine Heirloom Seed Library and
Right.
thinking about seeds as resurgence and insisting on futurity. And we are working on the Detours, a Decolonial Guide to the Palestine volume, and so many of the pieces in that volume insist on futurity and imagine and are not just about, right, Said's like permission to narrate and something I'm not having to ask permission to narrate, and also not having to ask permission to imagine
Right.
return and insisting on abolitionist futures, insisting on what is always narrated to us as impossible. And I'm on the sort of heels of teaching both racial and gender formations in the US, which is like a core course in feminist studies here at Santa Cruz, and touring War and Empire, my senior seminar. And part of the racial and gender formation, but I always show students the trans manifesto of demanding the impossible that Dean Spade
Mm.
put together, and what it means to sort of demand the things that we're told that are impossible, and insisting that return is not only not impossible, but is our future, right? Is
Yeah.
the future. And so so many pieces in that are doing the work of imagining uh museums that narrate what the liberation of Palestine looked like, right? Or imagining these kinds of futures that narrate the liberation of Palestine in a past tense, right? In sort of a memorializing moment to think about what it looked like, what return looked like in the beginning, what liberation looked like. Having libraries, building the architecture of libraries that will be in a liberated Gaza, having storytelling of people that traverse all of historic Palestine in a Palestine that was never colonized, right? A lot of people are doing these kinds of speculative work around what return means, how return does not mean returning to 1948, but how do we imagine return prismatically? Like, how do we imagine return from so many different angles and so many different ways of thinking, and the both the beauty and labor of that work of imagining.
Yeah. That's so great. And I'm glad you got there because I wanted to make sure to ask you about this project. So, you were just talking about Detours, a Decolonial Guide to Palestine. So, an
Mhm,
edited volume, you said it has more than 50 contributions, lots of this
mhm,
sort of speculative type thinking. And it's also part of an exciting series, right? So,
mhm,
it comes on the heels of Detours, a Decolonial Guide to Hawaii, and puts this into conversation with a wider, I would imagine, expanding series of places where tourism is problematic, but also opens possibilities for imagining or constructing our world otherwise.
mhm.
Do you have maybe one last thing you want to say about the book, and then we'll wrap up?
Yeah, I would just say that similar to how I sort of started talking about with the sort of fictive nature of a dissertation proposal and what I thought I was gonna do in the dissertation that became so different when I, sort of allowed the research to shift instead of staying anchored to what I thought I was gonna find out, right? And how it became this history of how solidarity tourism emerged in Palestine rather than this sort of narration or response, structure that I had imagined it. Similarly, when we sort of put out the call for the CFP for Detours Palestine, the second book in the Detour series that Bernadette Gonzalez and Heiko account, like how have so beautifully crafted with Detours of Decolonial Guide to Hawaii. We imagined that we would get a lot more work on tourism. Like we imagined that we would get narrations of walking tours, that we would get more narrations on what tourism and anti-colonial tourism look like in Palestine, and we did get contributions of that sort that are so vibrant and meaningful to the collection. And we also got so much of the speculative work. We got so much storytelling. One of our contributors wrote about translating graffiti in Palestine with his father, and how that sort of translation practices was initially just to sort of understand the meaning behind graffiti in Palestine, that became a narration on their relationship and how they, father and son, think about Palestine and its past and its present and its future through translation. And there are love letters to Palestine, right? There are stories of freedom, of mobility across Palestine. There are artworks that narrate the kinds of inherited experiences of violence under settler colonial occupation, and art that narrates that and also imagines a liberated future for Palestine. And so much of the work, I think, that we do in the volume, or that we really collect and share through the volume, is just a gift for archiving that imagining.
Well, that's great. When does it come out?
It is going to production very soon, so I imagine a year.
So listeners, keep your eyes peeled. And in the meantime, I can strongly recommend that you take a look at Invited to Witness Solidarity Tourism Across Occupied Palestine by our guest, Jennifer Lynn Kelly. It's such a fantastic book, and we've only just scratched the surface in this conversation. So if you found things of interest here, I can assure you, you will really get something out of the book. Am I correct in thinking that it's still open source?
It is on the Duke website. You can download the whole PDF.
Great. So you can go and download it, but also feel free to buy a copy. It's a lovely book with lots of great photos and pictures in it. So, Jennifer Lynn Kelly, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure having you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
And you've been on Bad Art, the world's premier anti-art podcast. Listeners, if you enjoyed this, please give us a review, tell your friends, and we'll be back soon. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much. This conversation's been lovely.